A round glass face, black numbers painted on white. The highest one on the dial reads 120. That gauge sat in the cab of a locomotive that pulled 880 tons at 100 miles per hour on ordinary Tuesday afternoons. It could not read past 120. Somebody specified it that way. 52 of these machines were built between 1942 and 1946, and every one of them was cut up for scrap. The men who ran them swore they went faster than the dial could count. The Pennsylvania Railroad built a locomotive that outran its own instruments, then destroyed the evidence one engine at a time over 5 years. Have you ever done something at work that nobody wrote down, and then watched the official record say something else entirely? Put it in the comments. This is the kind of story American Iron Works takes apart. Subscribe so the next one finds you. The class was called the T1, and it came out of Baldwin Locomotive Works at Eddystone rather than out of Altoona. Before the corrections start, one thing needs settling. Ralph P. Johnson was Baldwin's chief engineer, not the Pennsylvania's. He worked for the builder, selling a design to a customer, and that distinction matters a great deal later on. Johnson wanted a steam locomotive that could beat a diesel on a passenger schedule. The way he got there was strange. Most large steam engines put every driving wheel in one long connected row, turned by 2 enormous cylinders. The T1 splits them into 2 groups. 4 drivers up front with their own pair of cylinders, 4 drivers behind with a second pair, 2 engines under one boiler, both bolted to a single rigid frame. That arrangement is called a duplex. The shape of it was no accident either. The streamlining came from Raymond Loewy, the industrial designer who refined the Coca-Cola bottle and drew the Shell logo. He wrapped the T1 in dark Brunswick green with gold pinstriping and gave it a knife-edged prow that looked like nothing else on American rails. The 2 prototypes ran so far ahead of 1942 that crews nicknamed them Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers, and a Pennsylvania newspaper that December called them Land Dreadnoughts. Here is the correction. The comment section always wants to make, so let me take it first. A duplex is not an articulated locomotive. Big Boy is articulated. Big Boy carries a hinge, which lets the front half swing sideways through mountain curves in Wyoming. The T1 has no hinge anywhere on it. Both engine sets are bolted solid to one piece of steel because a joint that flexes is the last thing you want in a machine running flat out. 8 Big Boys survive today. 0 T1s do. The numbers behind this thing are not in dispute. 2 prototypes, 6110 and 6111, ordered on the 26th of June, 1940 for $600,000. 50 production engines authorized by the board on the 20th of December, 1944 at $14,125,000, $282,500 per locomotive. 25 were built at the railroad's own Juniata shops in Altoona. 25 came out of Baldwin at Eddystone, south of Philadelphia. Number 5524 was the last steam locomotive Altoona ever built in its entire history. On the stationary test plant at Altoona, engine 6110 produced 6,550 indicated horsepower at 85 miles an hour. Every one of those figures was written down by somebody at the time. The number everybody argues about was not. The T1 breathes through a Franklin poppet valve. A normal steam engine uses a sliding valve to let steam into the cylinder and push the spent charge back out, and at very high speed that sliding valve cannot shuffle back and forth fast enough to keep up. Poppet valves work the way the valves in a car engine work. Separate intake and exhaust, driven by camshafts, snapping open and shut on precise timing no matter how fast the wheels are turning. Each cylinder end carried its own intake and exhaust valves, 32 valves on the locomotive in total. Every one of them worked by an oscillating camshaft mounted above the cylinder. When the Pennsylvania bolted that system onto a test engine, K4 number 5399, it made over 40% more power above 80 miles an hour. Franklin guaranteed those valves for continuous running at 100 miles an hour, with short bursts to 125. Hold on to that guarantee. It becomes the entire story in about 4 minutes. The flaw sits inside the strength, which is what makes this machine worth 20 minutes of your life. Splitting the drive into 2 engines cuts the available grip in half, because each engine now holds the rail through 4 wheels instead of 8. So the T1 makes more power than its own footprint can put down. At speed, the front set breaks traction and spins. Then it bites. The instant it bites, the rear set lets go and spins in its place, and the whole cycle starts again from the other end of the locomotive at 70 miles an hour, with the drivers howling on the steel and the train barely gaining a length. Those 80-inch wheels turn 420 times every minute at 100 miles an hour. 7 full revolutions every second. The part I keep coming back to is that this was never a weak locomotive. It failed because it was too strong for the amount of steel it had touching the rail. That slip broke the valves, and the valves broke on one stretch of track over and over until somebody had to go and find out why. The failures clustered between Crestline, Ohio, and Fort Wayne, Indiana. Franklin Railway Supply could not explain it. Every valve they could reach came out and went under inspection. Nothing in the maintenance records accounted for what kept coming back broken. So a Franklin engineer named Julius Kirchhoff did something that has no business anywhere near a corporate maintenance investigation. He put a man on the trains. There was no clipboard and no letter of introduction. The technician rode as an ordinary passenger for a month, holding a stopwatch, counting mileposts out the window, and doing the arithmetic in his head. What that technician wrote in his log is the reason this argument is still running 80 years later. And Julius Kirchhoff never told the Pennsylvania Railroad what was in it. He went looking for a stronger alloy instead. A supplier put a man on its own customer's trains, found the answer, and filed it internally. Which bothers you more, that he did it or that it worked? Now the whole thing comes apart because there is no agreement on what the log actually said. Trains magazine, working from that research, prints 135 to 142 miles an hour on 2 occasions with short 6- and 7-car trains. A separate trains news report gives 141. And the summary of William Withen's own book, the historian who sat down with Kirchhoff and his colleague Ray Delano in the 1970s and recorded what they remembered, puts the observed speeds at 100 to 110. Those 3 figures cannot all be correct. 52 locomotives, 11 years on the property, and better than 8,000 miles a month on every engine in regular service. The fastest thing any of them ever did comes down to one man's arithmetic out a moving window. The word that matters here is ratified. On the 3rd of July, 1938, a British locomotive called Mallard came down Stoke Bank south of Grantham and hit 125.88 miles per hour. Behind it ran a dynamometer car full of instruments and engineers on a scheduled test, with the designer Nigel Gresley sitting aboard. The paper trace from that run is still readable today. One railroad treated a speed run as a documented event. The other treated it as Tuesday afternoon on the Fort Wayne division. And the only official instrument aboard any T1 was that speedometer, which had been told to stop counting at 120. Everything the T1 did was real. None of it was ratified, which means the argument cannot be closed by measuring again. By 1956, there was nothing left to measure. Read the dates flat, and the shape of this becomes hard to miss. The Pennsylvania Railroad posts the first operating loss in its history. Cylinder liners go into 6 to 1 on 11 and 7 more engines to cut tractive effort and calm the slip. The valve steel gets upgraded from mild steel to a higher strength alloy. The metallurgy problem, by the trust's own reading of the record, solved. Engine 5500 gets wrecked in a sideswipe with a K4 on the St. Louis division. Instead of rebuilding it as it was, the railroad fits Franklin Type B2 rotary cam gear, which strips out the buried gearboxes and makes the valve gear reachable from outside the locomotive. Number 5500 comes back and earns a reputation as the best engine in the class, from enginemen and shop crews alike. Pennsylvania Railroad correspondence shows they considered fitting that same gear to as many as 5 more T1s. It was not acted upon. That is the sentence I cannot get past. The fix existed, it worked, it was cheap next to a $14 million fleet, and it went into a filing cabinet. Because 1948 is also the year Martin W. worked into Clement, president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, announced that by May, every important east to west through passenger train would be diesel-powered west of Harrisburg. There is one more thing the record shows, and it belongs to the men rather than the machine. Engineers assigned to the T1 were given no formal training on how to run one. They stepped off a K4 they had known for 30 years onto a front-end throttle at 300 pounds of pressure with valves that answered instantly. Too much power too fast, and the drivers let go. In the autumn of 1946, the Chesapeake and Ohio borrowed two T1s, numbers 5511 and 5539, and ran them in normal service. The C&O reported no excessive tendency toward wheel slip at all, which is a remarkable thing to find in the file of a locomotive whose entire reputation rests on being uncontrollable. Same locomotive, different railroad, and the complaint disappeared. In 1949, most of the fleet comes off the front line. In 1952, all of them are out of service. By the end of 1953, they are struck from the roster entirely. In 1956, the last one goes under the torch. And in 1957, the Pennsylvania Railroad quietly sets aside about a dozen steam locomotives at its roundhouse in Northumberland, one from each major class, to keep. This at a time when the New York Central under Alfred Perlman was deliberately scrapping all but two of its own. The Pennsylvania was a preservation-minded railroad by the standard of its era. It built a collection on purpose. There was never a meeting where the T1 was rejected for that collection. The class was already gone when the railroad sat down to decide what deserved to survive. That is a sequence, not a sentiment, and it is worse. One piece of the T1 program did survive. Tender number 6659, 16 wheels, a coast-to-coast type, built to carry fuel and water across enormous distances without stopping. It was never assigned to any particular locomotive. It finished its working life as a fuel tank for a track department, which is almost certainly why nobody bothered to scrap it. In August of 2017, a group called the T1 Trust bought it for $25,000. It saves their project over $3 million. As of May 2026, their new locomotive, numbered 5550, is 65.4% complete. The boiler and the frame are due to be joined this year at Denison, Ohio. They are aiming at 2030. Whether it ever settles the speed question is a separate problem from whether the question was ever answerable. The Trust's own published answer names two places in America where a T1 could exceed 120 miles per hour, the test loop at Pueblo and parts of the Northeast Corridor. They hold no agreement with any Class 1 railroad, so the number stays open. The T1 was destroyed for being conspicuous. Too complex, too fast, too visibly the wrong answer in 1948. The single component of it that outlived all 52 survived because nobody could think of a reason to notice it. And the 53rd T1 cannot be finished without that anonymous water car bolted to the back of it. Whatever kills a machine and whatever saves a piece of it turn out to be the same force pointed in opposite directions, and once you start watching for that in industrial history, you stop being able to unsee it. That is what American Iron Works pulls apart. Subscribe, and the next one comes to you.